Welcome to Rise with the Sun, and the channel dedicated to exploring human addiction and contemplations upon that. And here we have The Urge, Our History of Addiction by Carl Erik Fischer. And I will explore this book. It is an incredible compilation of insight and information, but also personal account from Carl, which is incredibly powerful. So I will start with the introduction. I'm lying in bed when I hear the commotion. I peer through the doorway of my room, and right outside, the new guy is getting in Ruiz's face. There's a phone right outside the door, one of those sturdy metal payphones. It looks like it's being carried in from the street. And Ruiz, a gentle older man with shoulders stooped by the demoralization of his nth relapse and hospitalization, is just trying to talk to his family. But the new guy has been manic and pacing since he arrived a few hours ago, and he won't take no for an answer. I watch the new guy stalk the other way across the doorway, muttering to himself, menacing even in retreat. Then a warning shout echoes from much too far in the distance, and he appears once again, flying near horizontal to tackle Ruiz, dragging him off the phone. The staff quickly take him down. Thankfully, no one was seriously hurt. Shaken, I try to focus on my journal, but my mind races. My roommate, a burly, middle-aged guy with a scar down the side of his head, attesting to the brain injury that's brought him back here over and over again, turns to me laconically and says, "There goes dinner." I'm 29 years old, writing in my journal with a floppy felt tip pen, no ballpoints allowed, trying to understand how I went from being a newly minted physician in a psychiatry residency program at Columbia University to a psychiatric patient at Bellevue, the city's notorious public hospital. Bellevue is synonymous with the most challenging, chronic mentally ill cases, and now I'm locked on the dual diagnosis ward on the 12th floor near the top of the building, where they put people who have both substance use problems and other mental disorders. I've already recognized some of the faculty from when I applied here for residency, and I know from the tour I took as an applicant that the special prison ward, protected by a guardhouse with bulletproof glass, thickly barred glass, is a floor below us. I need that phone those two men were fighting over. It's my only way to reach the outside world, that other plane of reality where I once was a psychiatry resident. I'm having trouble accepting that I belong here, not there. Day by day, it seems more likely that what the doctors have been telling me is correct. That, just like the new guy, I too have had a manic episode. In my case, induced by weeks of stimulants and alcohol. But I'm still not sure what I should do. The next day, I meet with the whole treatment team. Half a dozen psychiatrists, therapists, counselors facing me across the massive table in one of those windowless hospital conference rooms. For the first time, I truly let my guard down and recount my whole drinking history. How I grew up with two alcoholic parents and swore to myself I'd never be like them. How even as I finished medical school at Columbia, I had the creeping sense that my drinking was out of control. How the blackouts got more and more frequent, but I didn't reach out for help, and I didn't accept the help that friends, colleagues, and supervisors had all offered, then implored me to take. I tell them everything, even the one time that I woke up on the floor of the hallway in my building, shirtless, my skin sticking to the tacky linoleum, locked out of my own apartment. It was only by getting to the roof and climbing down the fire escape that I made it to work that day at all. I was late again and so ashamed and scarred by what I said about me. It was obvious that something was wrong, but I never told anyone about it, because to do so would be to acknowledge that I had what I had long suspected. They ask me about my family. I tell them about my father's 4 rehabs and bottles of wine that my mother secreted around the house. I describe my parents as alcoholics, as I usually do, but I also finally give voice to that dangerous suspicion about myself. And I'm starting to realize that I'm an alcoholic too, and I break down crying. Despite all this, later that weekend I call my friend Ravi from the payphone, looking down the disorientatingly long hallway that stretches the whole length of the ward. He's helping me with all the logistics, setting up disability insurance, getting my rent paid, and generally making it possible for me to get rehab. A place I don't quite want to be, but I'm told I need. We talk about how it'll be good for me and how I've struggled for so long. His voice is strained. It's clear he's worried about me. So I hesitate for a moment. I have the clear sense of telling myself, this is truly a ridiculous question, don't ask him this. But then, ask him anyway, even as I keep one eye down the hallway for any potential assailants. Do you really think I can never drink again? I'm supposed to be headed to some specialized rehab for doctors, but I know nothing about it. I want to go, but not really. I need help, but maybe I can do it on my own, or at least find a better way. Why is this so hard? I did go to that rehab for doctors, and in time I returned to the residency program at Columbia. For years afterward, I was in supervised treatment. At a moment's notice, I had to be prepared to run across the medical center or across town to my urine monitor, a woman who would watch me urinate to make sure I didn't try to pass off somebody else's bodily fluids as my own. As I slogged through half a decade of this, I got more curious. I knew that addiction treatment system was broken, having experienced it at first hand, but the why was mystifying. Why was there a total separate system for addiction treatment? Why do we treat addiction differently from any other mental disorder? If everyone seems to know that the system is broken, why isn't anyone changing it? I decided to become an addiction medicine specialist. In a surreal twist, as I studied psychotherapy and medications, I was also going to my own treatment and meetings and generally trying to work out what recovery meant to me. As I finished training and joined the psychiatry and bioethics faculty at Columbia, the worst seemed to be behind me. But as I emerged from those revitalizing yet profoundly disorientating years, the same questions lingered incessantly. How did I get here, and what exactly had gone wrong in me? Or as patients often ask, what happened to me? Why am I like this? How do I get better? In search of answers, I immersed myself in the field, studying psychology and neuroscience of addiction. I wanted to find the right definition, the correct tidy medical theory that would explain it, but I was soon overwhelmed. The field seemed to be in chaos. Scientists and other scholars seemed bitterly divided, always taking past one another. Some insisted that addiction was primarily a brain disease. Others claimed that this brain-centric view blinded us to the psychological, cultural, and social dimensions, including trauma and systems of oppression. Few other fields of medicine are so powerfully driven by cultural bias and ideology. Everyone seemed to have their own take, as did every field of study. One summary of theories of addiction listed no fewer than 30 different models, from psychological concept to neurobiological mechanisms to economic models of choice. And those are just the ones deemed respectable today. Each one of them had something useful to add, but more often than not, their answers felt demoralizingly incomplete. I began working in psychiatry, not incidentally, at a time of increasing disillusionment with the simplistic view that all human suffering could be reduced to neurobiology. President George H.W. Bush had designated the 1990s the decade of the brain, but during the 2000s and into the early 2010s, as I finished my training, there were signs that neuroscience while useful and even revolutionary in some ways, was not sufficient to explain the complex phenomena of mental suffering. Researchers were still trying to make sense of what it meant to call something a mental disorder, and the picture was yet more complicated in the case of treatment. Antidepressants were nowhere near as useful as the first generation of heady advertisements had promised. Biotech companies were slashing funding and even shuttering their neuroscience research divisions altogether after years of failed drug discovery. There was a growing awareness that the country had been misled by pharmaceutical companies and not just the opioid manufacturers. These developments motivated my own turn from neuroscience research to bioethics, where I hope to incorporate a more thorough understanding of the social and political realities of mental suffering, along with the best science had to offer. Then, as I continued my research into addiction, I noticed something interesting. The broadest thinking and most creative scholars kept making odd and intriguing connections to fields beyond my usual horizons. They drew on ancient philosophy to clarify the problem. They looked to sociology to show how it is impossible to separate addiction from its cultural context, now and for generations back. They even delved into theology to trace how legacies of thinking about morality have powerfully influenced the way we think about choice and responsibility. In a short time, I became absolutely convinced that medical science alone, while important, was insufficient to understanding addiction. Understanding addiction in the present required looking to the past. Addiction seemed to be everywhere and at every time. Starting my investigations in the midst of an opioid overdose epidemic, I learned that human society has been racked by drug epidemics and dismaying regularity for more than half a millennia. I saw how centuries of policy, stigma, and racism are all inseparable from how we currently understand and treat, or fail to treat, addiction. We have long wielded the concept of addiction as a weapon, using it to wage war, not just on drugs, but also on people who use drugs. I was struck by how long societies have feared the corrupting forces of technology, from opioids and smartphones and porn on demand to syringes and telegraphs and sugar. It was clear that addiction was not just an issue of medical science, but also one of identity, power, commerce, and fear, as well as one of devotion. I got to leave Bellevue relatively quickly. By nothing more than the accident of birth, my status as a doctor, my Ivy League education, my ability to pay, my access to a program that happened to treat addiction somewhat adequately, my whiteness, and just dumb luck. I entered recovery, returned to a good job, and eventually got to write this book. If only everyone were treated the way I was, we'd all be better off. But make no mistake, I am not an unlikely case. I am not fundamentally different from Ruiz, or the new guy, or anyone else on that dual diagnosis floor. The most important lesson the history taught me is how divisions between us are just a story, one that has long fed injustice, and one that comes back to harm us all. I will continue to do so unless we start to look. It will continue to do so unless we start to look deeper. This book is a history of addiction. It is the story of an ancient malady that has ruined lives of untold millions, including not only those of its sufferers, but also the lives touching theirs, and yet it is also the story of a messy, complicated, and deeply controversial idea, one that has eluded definition for hundreds of years. Addiction doesn't just cut across time and place, it cuts across fields far beyond medicine and science to politics, spirituality, law, economics, philosophy, and sociology. Not to mention all the literature and art that point toward the ineffable gaps between. Addiction is a brain disease, a spiritual malady, the romantic mark of artistic sensibility, a badge of revolution against the sick society, and all of these things at once. This book is a history of ideas, a history of addiction as an idea, and a history of ideas about addiction. What does addiction mean to you? Everyone has a preconceived notion. Not only drug and alcohol problems qualify. Or can you be addicted to gambling, sex, eating, work, or even love? Is it a matter of severity, like drinking or using too much? Or is it driven by how you feel, some internal sense of being out of control? Is everyone somewhere on the addiction spectrum? Does not being able to put down your phone count? Or is it a clearly demarcated disease, neatly partitioned off from normal society? The point is not that these questions have easy answers, but that these are not purely scientific or medical questions. They are inextricable from our most closely held, culturally contingent, and often implicit beliefs and values. Questions about addiction are questions about what it means to be human. As I studied the many attempted responses to the problems of addiction, I came to distinguish between four broad approaches that have reoccurred throughout history. A prohibitionist approach has sought to control addiction through punishment and other law enforcement strategies. A therapeutic approach has argued that addiction is best handled as a disorder to be treated by the medical field. A reductionist approach has sought to explain addiction in scientific terms, often seeking biology-based cures. And mutual help approach has sought community healing and grassroots fellowship, and sometimes, but not always, spiritual development to recovery from addiction. Variations on each of these themes abound, and they also overlap and blend into one another at times. But overall, they occur with surprising regularity across centuries. What should not be surprising is that no single approach holds all the answers. Each of these approaches has had its turn in responding to addiction, often multiple turns. Whether a miracle drug, a new enforcement policy, or an evocative rehabilitation program, these interventions almost always took the form of a quick fix that would ostensibly solve the problem of addiction, or sweep it under the rug, or dominate and control it. None has ever been successful for long. With the benefit of history, we can see that these attempts were doomed to fail, even when their supporters' intentions were noble. Then what is to be done if these cycles have repeated themselves with such crushing regularity? I've come to believe that the history, while sometimes discouraging, ultimately lights a way forward. By accepting that addiction has been and will continue to be a part of human life, we can abandon dreams of eradicating it and free ourselves to look instead at the full variety of interventions available to help. The primary goal should be not victory or cure, but alleviating harm and helping people to live with and beyond their suffering. In other words, recovery. If we want to break the cycle, we must take the best of each of these approaches, medical, social, spiritual, and so forth, and apply their lessons in a truly holistic balance, while always being sure to let the history spark humility and openness to multiple perspectives. I don't mean to suggest that this path forward is easy. Confusion, fear, aversion often obscure the way, complicated by the fact that forces of oppression and domination commonly co-opt the idea of addiction for their own ends. Even as addiction recovery has emerged as our era's archetypal story of self-discovery and spiritual growth, substance use problems are still portrayed as a stigmatized and odious disease, as they were labeled when medical writers attempted to describe the phenomena centuries ago. What follows are two stories. The first and foremost is a story about addiction, treatment, and recovery across the ages. The second, alongside it, is the story of my own experience as a physician and a person in addiction recovery. I want to include my own story because ideas about addiction are necessarily intertwined with personal beliefs and experiences, and I want to disclose my biases rather than opt to tone a false objectivity. But I also hope to illustrate as vividly as possible the real human implications of this history and the ways it continues to exert force on the present. Not surprisingly, this investigation seldom yielded easy answers. Most often, it produced examples of hubris and failure, and of seemingly unending cycles of hatred and division. And yet, it never stopped feeling urgent to me. It helped me understand my past and that of my family, and it helped me in my work with patients. I've felt great kinship with people in years past who have battled addiction, and their stories gave me hope for recovery and the possibility of change. Though the changes ahead are daunting, I firmly believe that if we meet it with open eyes, the history will help us on our way forward. That was the introduction by Carl Erik Fischer for his book, The Urge, Our History of Addiction. I have read the introduction maybe 5, maybe 10 times, and it gives me great contemplation. And as I delve deeper into this book with you, I hope that it sparks a level of contemplation within you, and rise with the sun. The sun always shows up. It comes up, it goes down. Or perhaps more accurately, it's there and we move around it. And what an incredible role model the sun is for me and for, I'm sure, many others in multiple generations, and the beautiful message it sends to us when we just show up for the day, no matter how hard it is and no matter how easy it is. On the hard days, it's really sometimes easy to not show up, and on the really easy days, it's very easy to not do our own work and not do our own personal work. That keeps us vibrant, that keeps us sharing our inspiration with others, and also looking at others that are inspired and acknowledging that. So yeah, we have a beautiful ability to be able to contemplate and sit in our own space. And let's embrace that. Let's embrace that ability to sit in one place, to contemplate, and ultimately to be grateful for that ability. So thanks for joining the contemplation. Rise with the sun and go and inspire someone.